such a pleasure to introduce a dear friend and colleague, Jack C. Lane, Dr. Jack C. Lane, who is Professor of American History Emeritus and the College Historian at Rollins. He has had a scholarly interest in Florida history since he and Professor Saki O'Sullivan began team teaching a course on Florida studies at Rollins. And I think they still do that through the adult learning program, don't they? And together they also published in 1991 a Florida Reader, Visions of Paradise from the Spanish to the Present, which provides the basis for most Florida studies programs in the state. Professor Lane has published several articles on Florida history and is now editing and writing an introduction to an autobiography of Roy France, a popular professor at Rollins College in the 1930s. None of us would remember him. And a national figure who defended the right for free expression and association during the McCarthy era. That must be fascinating. Professor Lane developed his intense interest in Winter Park preservation when he began serving on the Casa Feliz Board of Directors. Recently, the Casa Feliz blog published his article entitled In Praise of Winter Park's Lowly Bungalows. I had the pleasure of reading that last week, and it reminded so much of my grandparents' bungalow. He was most recently involved in an initiative to prevent placing a baseball field at Martin Luther King Park, so we appreciate his work on that as well. Two things that Jack didn't ask me to say, but I happen to know, that I remember very vividly when Jack and Jan had their 50th wedding anniversary right here. It was so nice. It was a lovely occasion. And the other thing I know is that very recently their home on Lakeview Drive has been established as a historic home. Is that right, Jack? Did I say that correct? And so that will really be fun. I go by there all the time, so now I can look at it as a historic home. Jack? I'm going to be recording what he's doing, so that's why I'm still up here.
Well, thank you, Sandra. I'm honored to be here in this, speaking at this club. She mentioned that I have a very special, Jan and I both have a very special affinity with this club. She mentioned our 50th anniversary here at the club. Great occasion for us, at least. But also my daughter, who was married in Noah's Chapel, we had her reception here. So we have a close affinity with this club in many, many ways. The talk that I want to do today is a little bit unusual, okay? I'm going to be asking you to participate a little bit, perhaps only mentally, all right? But when I come to the end, it's going to be ask you a little more participation in what I hope I can convince you to do. Let me begin with a kind of little story here, okay? One of the best books on Florida, and one of my favorite books on Florida, is a Florida Guide. It's Florida, a guide to the southernmost state. This was done by the WPA in the 1930s. It is a fantastic book. If you've never looked at it, you should, because you can learn more about Florida reading this book than any other single book, even though it was written in the 1930s. There was a little, they did tours, about 18 of them around the state, and they noticed everything in this state. And one of my favorite excerpts is when they're describing Florida, and I think you'll be interested in it. This is a description of the Housekeepers Club in Miami. And this is the club here now. That building was built in 1921. And here is the description that the WPA guide gave to it. The Housekeepers Club is the oldest women's club in Florida. Founded in 1891 by Flora McFarland, the club was a social center of the countryside around Miami. Women came to the meetings by boat, particularly from communities on the Miami River. The mothers placed their small children in the nursery to sleep, and at the end of the meetings, the babies were picked up hurriedly, identified by their wraps. One night, a man named Dick Carney went into the nursery and switched the shawls. There was great confusion homeward bound, and in Miami homes the next morning, when mothers discovered they had the wrong babies. The incident was used by Owen Wister in his novel, The Virginian. Anyone read The Virginian? I haven't got it, but I would like to see that incident. That's from the WPA guide. Okay? I thought maybe you would like to see 4 or 5 of other women's clubs on the historic register, National Historic Register in Florida. There's the one in Boynton Beach, St. Petersburg, Punta Gorda, and Vero Beach. And as you can see, these were all built in the 1920s. And as I went through looking at these women's clubs, almost all of them were built in this period, particularly in this decade. And you can see there the architecture is so varied. Some of the architecture there I can't even really identify. But all of them have a distinction in Florida, particularly in their architecture. Here are 4 more in Redmond and Jacksonville. Stark, I do know the architectural style of that. That's a bungalow style, as a matter of fact. Tallahassee, a pretty impressive one there, and in Eustis. And here's yours. And you know, if you look through those, as I did, it seemed to me that this is by far and away the most elegant club in Florida. I believe we could say that without much prejudice, really. I love the style of this building. And you know and have heard, certainly, that this is neo-colonial. And all the characteristics, if you look up the characteristics of neo-colonial, all the characteristics are here in this building. The ridge pole, where the women's club is printed up there, all the way across this way, running parallel to the street. The buildings have a symmetrical front facade and an accented doorway, right? So there's very symmetrical. The features include elaborate front doors, often with decorative fan lights. And if you look behind you here, you can really see these fan lights here in this. These were almost always characteristic of this. These actually, though, are a derivation of, perhaps many of you know, of Palladian windows. And if you look around town, this was a window that was designed in the Renaissance period in Italy. And if you look around town, you will find these Palladian windows everywhere. The church, a congregation church down the street has them also. And symmetrical windows flanking the front entrance, often in pairs of threes, and columned porches. And the question is, why did the women's club in the 1920s choose a colonial style? And one of the things I found out when I was doing some research on little Gothic churches, wooden Gothic churches around the state, and when I tried to research the church historian of the Congregational Church when I was trying to research the reasons why they built the two churches they built. It's almost impossible to get at the motivation of these decisions. But if we probably can guess that the reason for it was that this was a very popular style in the United States in the 1920s, particularly beginning back in the early 19th century. And the reason for that was a kind of rise in patriotism in this country. The Gothic style was a European style, and Americans wanted to be a little more American in their styles, and they went back to the colonial period and chose that. I have a depiction of one of the old houses of the 17th century, and you can see on the front porch there is a semblance here of the colonial style of homes there. And if this is the one that was built in the 1920s, so you can see the resemblance of that to your own building. It has a kind of elegance to it that was very, very appealing to the people of the period. And I would argue too, one of the ways of creating a sense in the town that you're really, really important is to choose a style such as this, which would give you a sense of being part of this nation and a very important part of the nation. So I think there was some sense here in choosing this style, not only because it's a very, very nice style, but it has some social implications for it. I went to the Wooded Park Library and picked up some postcards of the early buildings of this building here. And you can see how the landscaping has changed over the years. Many of you may have seen these. I'm not sure the dates on all of those, but I tried to arrange them what looked to me to be chronological. I like the landscaping there. I particularly like this landscaping here. So that has a lot of color here, right? So let me start with something here. It's a little unusual, I think. Here I'm suggesting to you that let's talk about this building and its place in the city. And let me provide you with some 3 plausible scenarios as a way of getting you thinking about the significance of this building. Number 1, a generous donor offers to fund and endow a building, and I don't know why that is not coming out, and promises fund and endow a new building. Oh, and promises to include in that all the new amenities that you could possibly want in a new building. Okay? So he comes to you, generous donor, and makes this offer. Okay? That's one plausible scenario. The club decides that it could fulfill its purpose on a smaller building with less maintenance costs, and it moved to another facility. Then what happens to the building? That's a plausible scenario. And along with that, an even more interesting one, the Women's Club decides, heaven forbid, to disband, and the developer offered large sums of money to buy the property, planning to demolish the building and to replace it with an apartment retail complex. The money would be used as an endowment fund for student scholarships and other philosophic endeavors. Now, those are 3, keep those in mind. I would argue that these are critical issues that those who own historic landmarks may one day have to make a choice on. And in that sense, your views toward those three scenarios I just gave you, and there may be other scenarios that I haven't thought of, those views toward these scenarios reveal much about people's attitude toward historic preservation. Okay? So, I'm asking you to think of this building in the sense that things could happen to it that we can't predict right now, but that in thinking about those three plausible scenarios, it gives us a chance to give a little more interest in the meaning of this building and its place in Winter Park. Okay? Now, I'm not going to ask you, though I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to do so, what you thought of any one of those scenarios. I'm more than willing to hear any comment on them you want to. Anybody want to? I'm not going to pressure you. Yes?
I would say the third scenario in which the developer buys it and tears down the building would not apply here because this building is already on the National Historic Register. You cannot do that.
That is not true.
Not true?
It's true that you're on the National Register, but it is not true that this building cannot be torn down.
Could you speak a little
It
louder?
just won't be on the Historic Register anymore. Okay? The Historic Register will not, these people, they don't have policemen coming in and telling you, you can't do things like that.
Sir, could you repeat the question or the statement that was made and then?
The question was, that third scenario is not plausible because it's on the National Historic Register, it could be torn down. And my answer was, no, that's not true. It can't be torn down, you just won't be on the National Register anymore.
This is an opportunity for me to mention something that I don't think any of you know, and that is about 6 months ago, I had a call from a realtor, a very serious realtor, who said she had a buyer who wanted to buy the property and build a steakhouse.
Okay, then these scenarios are not implausible, are they? Okay, so you should think about it. This is something that I'm just asking you to think about. Okay? Yes.
Maybe you should explain how that process would work. Because it's on the National Historic Register, if somebody wants to tear it down, how would that work?
Well, I don't know, you'd have to inform them that this is what you're doing, that in this scenario, you no longer would have a club here. The building was standing. Who owns the club? You own it. Well, you want to do something with this building, you think. Okay? You need some money out of it if you want to continue what you're doing, or if you disband it, then something has to be done with it. I don't know exactly the details of the process, but you could take yourself off the Historic Register. Remember, Winter Park City Commission took the Cakin House off the Historic Register. Okay? So it can be taken off the register anytime you want to. The register is not does not have an enforcement crew that comes out and talks to you and tells you, you can't do this and you can't do that. If you wanted to continue on the register, there are certain restrictions as long as this building is here.
May I ask?
Yes.
A question. The purpose of being on the register? What is
The purpose of it?
Yes.
It is to make sure that as long as you're on the register, nothing happens to this building. It's to save the building, or to prevent you from making additions to this building which would destroy the character of the building. Okay? It's very important to be on there, and it tells everybody this is a historically important building.
But you mentioned that it protects it in your first sentence. In what manner? From being
Karen.
Jack, could you explain the difference for them between the local register and the national register?
Yes. There's, as far as I know about it, it is not much difference in its details about what you can or cannot do with the building for the local register and the national register. But the national register, in a certain sense, has less authority over you than a local register, which you would have to go through the planning board, the preservation board, and the commission to get anything done here. It makes it much more difficult here to have it on the local register, to make any changes in this building whatsoever. Okay? So this is just some ways of thinking. So let me present what I would consider the importance of this building and where this club fits into it. Historic heritage are defined in this way. They're ways of living developed by a community and passed on from generation to generation. Customs, values, practices, objects, and places. Visually, the historic heritage can be observed in the natural environment, in landscapes, in parks, and also in the built environment, houses and other buildings. There is, among those who studied historic preservation, a kind of heritage cycle. And I think this is very important. I've always seen this as a way of explaining things to us. By understanding, people value heritage. By valuing, they want to care for it. By caring for it, they want to appreciate it. By appreciating it, they want to understand it, and so the cycle continues. So, educating ourselves about historic preservation is critical to preserving our heritage. Okay? As a part of historic preservation, there's always, and this is lost sometimes, buildings and other historic, well, the historical situation of any town is the fact that it creates a sense of place in just the same way that homes do create a sense of place. Senses of places are places that have an identity and a character that is immediately recognizable by a visitor and is valued deeply by the residents. These places include both buildings and the surrounding landscape. Placeless landscapes, these are those that have no relation to the setting where they're located. For example, strip malls. They all look alike, virtually, and they could be anywhere. They're just placeless. When older homes, and also places are placeless landscapes, or when older homes or commercial buildings are replaced by oversized houses and buildings with incompatible size, such settings have lost their sense of place. All right. Now, it is true that perhaps 100 years from now, they will be looked upon at that. But in the immediacy, you've lost the sense of place, and therefore lost your history, your sense of the past. Okay. So how does the Women's Club contribute to Winter Park's sense of place? In the first place, it is a major contributor to Interlochen Avenue, which is on the National Historic District. It's a National Historic District. Okay. So it contributes to that. And look at these styles and places that are on the historic register on Interlochen. All Saints, which is the Gothic style. The Congregational Church. This is full disclosure time. As I said, I am a member of the Congregational Church and I'm its historian. And I'm becoming very frustrated because this church, which is on a location as the oldest church in Winter Park, 1885. Its original church, which was a Gothic church like this one here, you see here, but it was wooden, was torn down and demolished in order to build the fellowship hall behind it. Now, this was in the 1930s. Hamilton Hope wanted to save it because the original classes of Rollins were held in that little wooden church. Hope wanted to save it. And the church, yeah, fine, okay. But then as they were getting ready, and he wanted to move it on campus. As they were getting ready to move it, the engineers discovered, hold it, hello, it won't go down the streets of Winter Park in 1930s. So they demolished it, sold the wood for $100. Now, look, think of this. Not only, I realize this is the depths of the Depression, okay? But not only did the church fail miserably to save this church, but so did the city. Somebody in the city should have stepped up and said, no, we will save this somewhere. Okay? Because the oldest church, we just lost the oldest church in Winter Park. And to me, that's a sin to have done that. Well, okay, I've got that out of my system. But this church was built in 1925. It is not on even on the Winter Park Historic Register. So it's an embarrassment to me. And I want to see if I can change that. At least get it on the Winter Park. I tell you, putting something on the National Register is not an easy thing to do. If you've gone through it, it is tough to do. And takes a lot of work. So this is Congregational Church. Notice it's built in 25, neo-colonial. Except they went right back to an old colonial church in Salem to get the style of this here. But you know, it was there. They decided on that architecture for the same reason you did. That's the country club here, and this is my favorite house, which names I forget right now. What is it? Yeah, Osceola Lodge, built, and. It's pretty much the style of the Craftsman style, yeah.
Members know this, but guests may not. This is where our club started in 1915 at Osceola Lodge, which is of course still down the street about 2 blocks.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Senator. My favorite house in Winter Park. If I had the money to build a house, that's what I would build in Winter Park. That's just my preference. Here's, of course, Casa Feliz, which we all know what happened to that. Barely saved this house.